Collections of Shiite Hadith can go back to any of the Imams. So if you take a collection of Shiite Hadith, really a minority, a substantial minority, but still a minority of traditions will go back to Muhammad himself, and most of them will go back to one of the Imams, which is considered legitimate for Shiites because the Imams embody also the authoritative quality, the spiritual authority of the Prophet Muhammad. The other difference is that for Sunnis, all of the companions, all of the Sahaba are considered to be authoritative as transmitters of things that Muhammad said or did. But Shiites also consider the Sahaba to be people who did not, for the majority of whom, did not recognize Ali as the immediate successor of the Prophet. Which means for them, the Sahaba do not have a blanket authority. So for those traditions that do go back to the Prophet Muhammad instead of to one of the Imams, there are only certain Sahaba that they would take to be as authoritative transmitters, and those would be people who had either were close to Ali or who had somehow openly supported the idea that he should succeed the Prophet Muhammad. Now, nonetheless, some of it is very similar, but sometimes you see this difference. So one of the important differences in Shi'ism is they recognize as one of the requirements of religion that something that's called walaya, which means in this particular context, in the Shiite context, the obedience and devotion to the Imams. And I'll put up, sorry, this is the Shiite perspective. So let me give you an example of what this might look like in terms of differences between a Sunni and a Shiite hadith. So this is, I omitted the longer isnad. But here, Abdullah ibn Omar, who is the son of the Omar, the second caliph, and a very, very important transmitter of hadith in the Sunni tradition, says, Islam is based upon 5. This is where the 5 pillars come from as a kind of collection, like a firm collection. Islam is based upon 5. To testify that none has the right to be worshipped by God and that Muhammad is the messenger of God, the shahada. Right? To pray the prayers, meaning the salat. To pay zakat, the mandatory alms. And to perform the hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. And to observe the fast during the month of Ramadan. Okay, the 5 pillars of Islam, as I'm sure you're already familiar with. Then we get a Shiite version. So you see, this doesn't go back to Muhammad. It says Abu Basir asked Jaffar Sadiq, who was the 6th Shiite Imam, and one of the probably maybe 40-50%, maybe more than that, of Shiite hadith go back to Jaffar Sadiq. Very prolific person for the basis of 12 Shiite hadith. So his companion says, Abu Basir says to him, "May I be your ransom?" That's a kind of formulaic show of devotion. "Tell me about the religion that God has required of his servants. What is it?" Jaffar Sadiq said, "To testify that there is no God but God, Muhammad is the messenger of God, to perform the prayer, give zakat, make pilgrimage to the house if one has the means, and to fast the month of Ramadan." Almost the same, right? As what we've just seen from Abdullah bin Omar. And then it says he was silent for a while, so the transmitter saying that, and then he said, "and walaya." He said it twice. Then he said, "This is what God has required of his servants, truly the messenger of God. You have a good example," quoting the Quranic verse that I just put up before, "it is incumbent upon people to follow it." Right? So this comes from a collection called El-Kafi. This is the earliest of the canonical Shiite collections of hadith. So you can see the differences in terms of who it goes back to. And on the one hand, a closeness, the fundamentals of religion are the same, but with the addition of this loyalty to the Prophet Muhammad. Okay. One other thing, and I think I alluded to this, or someone asked me a question about this and I answered it. Jumping back for a second to the Sunni tradition, for the Sahaba, as I said, it did not matter what your status was. And so there are, among the Sahaba who might relate traditions from Muhammad, there certainly are women. And even in the other generations too, although they go down as the generations go up in terms of the proportion of women. But certainly neither gender nor status nor social status, nothing like that would have mattered as long as you could reliably have been said to have seen or heard Muhammad do whatever it was that you were relating. So one of the most prominent relators of Hadith is his wife Ayesha, for a number of reasons. First of all, because Ayesha was very close to Muhammad, right? And she knew things about Muhammad that even his closest male companions would not have known, like how did he behave with his wife when he was alone with her in the house? And she relates some intimate details, for example, about that relationship and what he was like as a husband. Secondly, because Ayesha was very young, obviously, when the Prophet died. Right? She was a teenager, somewhere in her teen years when the Prophet died. So she could live for quite a long time. Right? So those Sahaba who were relatively young or lived further out, of course, people would, sometimes there were only, at a certain point, there were only so many surviving Sahaba, right, that people would want to go to for authoritative information. So that's part of it as well. But also, Ayesha had a reputation for being a person of great knowledge, not just about the Prophet. So she's said to have lots of knowledge about pre-Islamic history, about pre-Islamic poetry. She was said to have been a person who collected lots of knowledge, and people would go to her as an authority in that way. So she was understood to have a great memory. However, Shiites, for example, Ali and Ayesha end up on opposite sides of a battlefield during the first civil war during the time of Ali's caliphate. And so Ayesha would definitely not be someone who would contribute to Shiite Hadith, for example. So that would make since some of those sources would be different, Ayesha relates so much material, there will be some differences certainly in the Hadith. Okay, are there any, I have some examples that I want to give of different types of Hadith, but questions? Yes?
So you said that the Shiites do not consider all of the Sahaba legitimate.
That's right.
Because of their, as a source. Right.
Yeah.
Because of their opinion on Ali. And
Yeah.
I'm just confused
that
about
would be their,
when they become disqualified. Like, is it their opinion on Ali as not being the first caliph, or they didn't recognize his legitimacy as the fourth?
Well, of course, what the Sahaba thought about who should have control of the community, or who should lead the community, I should say, not have control of the community, was something that worked itself out after the death of Muhammad and over time, and with lots of different opinions. So it's not so much that they disqualified them one by one, but they would only rely on those Sahaba who they knew were very loyal to Ali, right? Which is really a relative handful of people from that early. One important source that Shiites and Sunnis share is Ibn Abbas. And Ibn Abbas transmits, unbelievable numbers. He's one of the most prolific transmitters of Hadith, also of commentaries on the Quran. And he is someone, because he was a cousin of Ali and close to Ali, he's someone that you will find transmitting material in some Shiite traditions as well as some Sunni traditions.
So it wasn't like at that first meeting when they're making this decision, there are some guys who are like, no, you're picking the wrong guy, and now those are our... Okay.
Yeah, no. This would be, because again, the Shiites who are putting together collections of Hadith and who are transmitting Hadith, they're doing this at a much later period. Mm-hmm. And even in some ways later in a formal way, some way later than Sunnis, because remember the imams. There's a presence of imams until the 9th century, till the late 9th century. So, in other words, Shiites who follow this particular school of law always had a kind of personal authoritative source to go to. Right? By the 9th century, Sunni Muslims who didn't recognize those imams really were relying completely on the reports about Muhammad. Yes, Karen.
So is it fair to say that from a Shia perspective, the imams were the ones who determined what source from the...
Not really the imams. Because they were sources themselves. Right? So if Jaffar Sadiq is not the actual source, let's say he is in the isnad, but he's not the final source, his final source will usually be his father, or it will be Ali. Right? So where you would rely, let's say, where Ibn Abbas might appear in a Shiite isnad, would be in a transmission about Ali. Ibn Abbas said, Ali said, such and such.
Looking at some of the same collections and just selecting, or were
There was a lot of, the collections don't exist yet, right? I mean, like the canonical status, even the canonical status takes time to establish. So it's not that they're looking at the same collections. However, this was a very open scholarly culture. So you will find Shiite hadith, Shiite interpretations, traditions about tafsir, interpretations of the Quran attributed to Jaffar Sadiq, or to his father, Muhammad al-Baqir. So these were Jaffar Sadiq, the 6th Imam, and his father, the 5th Imam. They were people who also had Sunni students who came, and they weren't really quite Sunnis then, but whatever, students who weren't Shiites, who didn't recognize them as imams, but recognized them as authorities, right, as knowledgeable authorities. And certainly there were Shiite followers of Jaffar Sadiq that would go and visit the teaching circles of Abu Hanifa or something like that, who's a Sunni, considered a Sunni authority, founder of one of the Sunni schools of law. So you shouldn't imagine that these are two traditions that are developing like in complete isolation from one another. There are scholars who are moving around and talking to each other. But this collection, for example, the Kulaini's Al-Kafi, is written in the mid-10th century. Right? And he's collecting material that circulated in various ways prior to the 10th century. Okay, so it is later than Bukhari's collection, but he's not reading Bukhari, but to some extent. It's not exactly the same, but to some extent, yes.